He was 19. He was drunk. He was proud. He shoved the old man in the chest and threatened to take his hat off by force, and the old man did not move, did not flinch, did not even blink, because the old man had already survived the Chasen Reservoir and the Tet Offensive and the burial of every friend he had ever made in uniform, and a shove in a diner on a rainy Tuesday was not anything new to a man like him. The shove sent a coffee mug sliding off the edge of the table. The silverware rattled. Every veteran in the diner stopped chewing at the same exact second. Behind the counter, a waitress froze with the coffee pot still in her hand. At the back booth, a retired officer set down his fork. And in the doorway, a mother pulled her child closer to her hip because she could feel in the air what was about to happen before anyone opened their mouth. CTA1, if this story just earned a place in your chest, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Leave a single short phrase in the comments. Semper Fi, never forget, stay strong. Whichever one your heart picks is the right one. Every word left behind here honors a real warrior in spirit. Every view of this story is one more reminder that quiet heroes still walk among us. The diner was called Millie's. It sat on the corner of Main and 3rd in a small town in Tennessee where most people had grown up there, or married into the town, or had been laid to rest in the cemetery 2 blocks east of the post office. Millie's had been serving biscuits and eggs since 1962. The linoleum had not been changed in 60 years. The chalkboard above the register had been wiped and rewritten so many times that the black paint had soaked deep into the wood. Millie herself had passed in 1997. Her daughter Ruth had taken over. Ruth had kept every photograph on the wall exactly where Millie had hung them. That included the framed poster of a Marine in dress blues from 1968 that hung above Booth 3. Booth 3 was the booth where the old man sat. Outside, the rain had been falling since before sunrise. The American flag above the gas station across the street had been snapping in the wind all morning. Inside, the windows were fogged from the coffee steam, and the oven heat and the breath of 63 veterans gathered for the Free Veterans Day breakfast Ruth put on every November 11th for anyone who had ever carried the weight of this country. CTA2, if you have ever served, or if you have loved someone who served, drop their name in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel while you are there. Every name left on this channel becomes part of a quiet wall that breathes. Every view of this story helps carry the weight that real veterans carry every day of their lives, the weight that most of us never see but should always remember. The old man had walked in at 6:45 that morning, the same time he walked in every Tuesday and every Thursday and every Veterans Day for 19 years. He had nodded at Ruth in the way he always nodded at her. He had tipped his faded gray cap to the retired Navy lieutenant who always sat at the counter by the window. He had taken his usual seat at booth 3, the booth with the Marine poster above it. He had ordered the same breakfast he always ordered, 2 eggs over easy, white toast, no butter, black coffee, no sugar. He had set his cap gently on the seat beside him, the same seat he always set his cap on, and that cap had rested there so many times over 19 years that the booth now had a small permanent dent in the leather where the embroidered words Vietnam veteran had pressed their pattern into the cushion. His name was Walter Brennan. Everyone in town called him Hank. Hank was 78 years old. His hands shook a little when he lifted the coffee cup. His hair was silver and thin. The dog tag chain around his neck caught the light from the fogged window every time he turned his head just slightly. His eyes were the kind of eyes that do not give away their story. They were the eyes of a man who had already given everything he had to give and was now simply watching the world pass by in patient silence. He had served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps. He had fought at the Chasen Reservoir in the winter of 1950 when the temperature had dropped to 30 below and his rifle had frozen to his gloves, and 18,000 American Marines had stood against 100,000 enemy soldiers and somehow held the line anyway. He had fought in Hugh City during the Tet Offensive of 1968, when he had been a young staff sergeant, and his unit had gone house to house and room to room for 47 straight days. And he had never once talked about any of it to anyone since he had come home. CTA3, if this story is the kind of story that finds you and stays with you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you too. Drop a single phrase in the comments below. Semper Fi, never forget, stay strong. Every word planted in the comment section of this channel is one small flag on the grave of an unknown soldier. Every viewer of this story is one more voice telling this country that quiet courage still matters. At 7:45, the diner door opened, and the noise came in before the men did. It was the sound of 3 young men laughing too loudly for the time of morning, the laugh of young men who had been drinking since midnight and had not yet decided whether to sober up or to keep going. They were in their early 20s. The first two wore college hoodies and baseball caps turned backward. The third wore a dress blue jacket from one of the state military academies, and his jacket was crisp, and his chin was high, and his eyes had the look of a young man who had been told his whole life that he was going to be a great officer and had finally started to believe it himself. His name was Jason Cole. His friends called him Jay. Jay had joined the ROTC program because his father had been a Marine and his grandfather had been a Marine, and he had grown up watching war movies at family dinners, and somewhere along the way he had confused being born into a military family with understanding what the military actually meant. He had been drinking since midnight. He had not slept. He had driven 40 minutes from the academy because someone had told him Veterans Day meant free biscuits at Millie's, and he had come to collect. He had not come to listen. He had not come to learn. He had come because the biscuits were free, and because the girls from town always showed up early on Veterans Day, and he had wanted to be seen. CTA4, if you are still watching, you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Drop one phrase below. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. And hit subscribe before you scroll on so the next story like this one finds you the moment it is released. Every veteran whose name is spoken on this channel counts on people like you to keep speaking it. Jason walked in and the diner paused in the way that diners pause when a young man in a crisp dress blue jacket walks in on Veterans Day. Then it resumed because Ruth had a quiet rule that every person in uniform got the same seat at the counter regardless of who they were. He ordered a coffee. His two friends sat on either side of him at the counter. They talked loudly. They talked about the academy. They talked about how tough the drill sergeants were. They talked about how soft the older generation had been. They talked about how if they had been alive during Vietnam, they would have won the war in 6 months. They talked about how all the Vietnam veterans they had ever met were just broken old men who had never learned to handle real pressure. They talked about how those men had ended up on the streets, on pills, on the bottle. They talked about how those men had never learned to stand up and be a real man about what they had done. And then Jason turned his head. He saw booth 3. He saw the old man in the faded gray cap. He saw the Marine poster above him. He saw the chain of dog tags around his neck. He saw the Vietnam service ribbon pinned above his left breast pocket, and something inside Jason cracked the way things crack inside young men who have been drinking since midnight and have been told their whole lives that they are tougher than everyone else. He stood up. CTA5, stay with this one. Subscribe to this channel so this story follows you home. Drop a single short phrase in the comments. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. Every phrase that you leave behind on this channel is one more quiet voice reminding this country that real courage still walks our streets, still eats breakfast in our diners, still needs the respect of the people who never had to carry the weight they carried. He crossed the diner. He did not look where he was going. He barely saw the other veterans at the tables he passed, the older men with their own faded caps and their own service ribbons and their own quiet stories that they had never told anyone. He barely saw the men who had nodded at each other across this same linoleum floor every Veterans Day for 20 years. He barely saw the men who had looked at Hank Brennan across this room the way soldiers look at each other when they remember something the rest of the world has forgotten. Jason did not see any of them. Jason only saw the old man. He only saw a target. He only saw the kind of man he had been told his whole life was not worthy of the uniform. He stopped at booth 3. He stood over the old man. He put one hand on the edge of the table and leaned his weight forward until his shadow fell across Hank's plate and across Hank's coffee and across Hank's folded hands. He said something low. His mouth was moving. His eyes were hard. His body was leaning forward the way bodies lean forward when they are about to make a scene. And then he raised his voice, and what he said echoed off the linoleum floor and reached every table in the diner. He said the old man should be ashamed to wear that hat. He said the old man should take the hat off because it was embarrassing. He said that if the old man had been half the Marine he thought he was, the war would have been over in 6 months. He said that tens of thousands of good men had died for nothing because of men like him. And then he said the word that no veteran ever wants to hear spoken by another person wearing the uniform of the country that sent him to the war. He said it loud enough that the retired Navy lieutenant at the counter flinched. He said it loud enough that the older man at table 2 dropped his fork. He said it loud enough that the mother in the doorway pulled her child against her hip and walked out the front door without buying anything. CTA 6. If this story broke something open in your chest the way it broke something open in mine, subscribe to this channel before you forget. Drop a single phrase in the comments. Semper Fi, never forget, stay strong. Everyone who watches these stories is part of a quiet wall that stands for the warriors who can no longer stand for themselves, and every view of this story is one more stone placed on that wall. The old man still had not moved. He had not raised his head. He had not looked away from the cold coffee in front of him. His hands were folded in his lap, the right hand resting on the left, the way a man's hands fold when he has held a rifle for so many years that they have learned to rest like that whenever his body finally stops moving. The waitress behind the counter could see his dog tag chain rise and fall with every breath. Slow and even, slow and even, slow and even, the way a man breathes when he has learned to count his breaths in combat and has never learned to stop. Jason did not understand. Jason did not see it. Jason only saw a slow old man in a faded cap, and he felt powerful standing over him, the way young men feel powerful standing over anyone who does not fight back. So he leaned closer. He put his hand on the old man's shoulder. He squeezed. He pushed backward against the booth wall. He shoved him. The coffee mug rattled. The silverware rattled. The diner went so quiet that the rain on the windows became the loudest sound in the room, and the old man still did not move. He lifted his eyes. He looked at Jason. And Jason saw his own face reflected back in those eyes, except the man in the reflection was not 19 and drunk and proud. The man in the reflection was 22 and shaking and holding a buddy's dog tags in his fist and trying not to scream in a jungle he could never tell anyone about. And Jason felt something move inside his own chest that he did not have a name for, and he gripped the old man's shoulder harder because he did not understand what he was feeling and he wanted it to stop. The old man only watched him. The diner only watched them. And the moment stretched on until the clock on the wall had ticked out 7 full seconds of pure silence. CTA 7. Subscribe now so you never lose this story. Drop a single phrase in the comments. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. Every comment on this channel is one small flag planted next to the flag of a warrior who cannot plant his own flag anymore, and every view of this story is one more voice keeping the memory of a generation alive in a country they built with their sweat and their sacrifice. In the back booth of the diner, near the corner where the wall met the window that looked out toward the courthouse square, an older man had been quietly eating his breakfast for the last 45 minutes without anyone noticing him. He was 71 years old. He had silver hair just like the man in booth 3. He had a faded olive jacket over a civilian blue polo shirt. He had dog tags of his own resting under his shirt. He had a face that had not been handsome for 40 years, but had instead grown into the kind of face that earns the trust of children and strangers and dogs. It was the kind of face that had paid a price and was not ashamed of the price it paid. Every few minutes he had been glancing up at booth 3, the way a man glances up when he is recognizing someone he has not seen in a very long time. And when Jason shoved the old man in booth 3, this older man in the back booth did not flinch. But he did push his plate away. He did lay his napkin down. He did stand up. He did button his jacket because even in a civilian jacket he had been trained that when you stand to address a senior Marine, you stand properly and you button up. So he stood properly now. His shoulders were straight. He began to walk across the diner toward booth 3. CTA 8, subscribe to this channel so this story stays with you forever. Drop a single phrase in the comments below. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. Every comment on this channel is one more quiet voice speaking the names of warriors who cannot speak their own names anymore. And every view of this story is one more candle lit in the memory of a generation that earned our freedom and never asked us for anything in return. The retired officer reached booth 3 in 7 slow steps. He did not run. He did not rush. He walked the way senior officers walk when they have learned that the louder someone is, the slower you should approach them because loud people always quiet down when they realize that the room has stopped being on their side. He stopped directly between Jason and Hank. He stood with his back to Jason. He looked down at Hank. He recognized him. There was no question in his eyes. There was no doubt in his eyes. There was only the look a soldier gives another soldier when he sees him 20 years after the war and realizes that they have both somehow made it home, and that neither of them has ever forgotten the men who did not. He raised his right hand in a crisp salute that had not lost its straightness in 50 years. He held that salute, and he said the one phrase that ended everything. He said Charlie 15, Hugh City, February 1968. Master Sergeant Walter Brennan, the last surviving Marine of the 42 who went in. He said it in one breath. He said it in the way a man says the name of an entire fallen brotherhood in a single sentence. And when he finished, every veteran in the diner knew exactly what those words meant, and they all began to rise at the same exact second, in the same exact way, and the sound of 63 chairs scraping back across the linoleum was the loudest sound the diner had ever heard. And then it went silent again. And Jason Cole stood alone, his hand still half raised off the old man's shoulder, his mouth still half open on a sentence he would never finish. And he looked around the diner at 63 old men standing at attention, and he did not know what to do, and the colonel did not look back at him yet. CTA 9, stay with this story until the very end. Subscribe to this channel, drop a single phrase in the comments, Semper Fi, never forget, stay strong, whichever one your heart holds. Every word left on this channel becomes part of the wall that stands for the warriors who can no longer stand for themselves. And every view of this story is one more voice reminding this country that quiet courage still lives in our diners, in our churches, in our VFW halls, in our grocery stores, on every quiet corner where an old man sits with a faded cap. The colonel turned around. He looked at Jason Cole. It was the first time Jason had been looked at by a man who had been shot at and had not flinched, and his hand came off Hank Brennan's shoulder without him even deciding to remove it. He said the words that ended everything a second time. He said, "Stand down, son." He said, "You are addressing a Marine who carried your grandfather's grandson out of a burning truck in 1971 and who came home and never told a soul about it." He said, "You are addressing a man who has sat in this same booth every Tuesday and every Thursday and every Veterans Day for 19 years. He said, you are addressing a man who still tips the waitress 20% on his fixed income and who still stops to let every child in this town cross the street in front of him at the crosswalk, and who has not once raised his voice against any citizen of this country until you walked into his diner tonight." The colonel said all of that in 3 sentences. He said it in the way only a retired field officer can say a thing, when he is no longer asking and is now telling. And Jason's face changed. Jason's shoulders fell. His jaw tightened and then released and then tightened again, and his eyes began to water in the way that men's eyes water when they finally understand they cannot undo what they just did. And he did not speak for a long, long time. And then he whispered, almost to himself, almost to the linoleum, almost to the rain on the window, that he was sorry. And he said it in the small voice of a 19-year-old who has just heard the phrase that ended his arrogance, and who has realized that it ended him too. CTA 10. If you have ever loved a veteran, if you have ever lost a veteran, if you have ever had a name in your heart that you wished more people on this earth would say out loud, drop that name in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel. Press the bell if you can. Every story told here is one more small flag planted in honor of the warriors who cannot plant their own flags anymore. And every viewer of this story is one more quiet voice keeping their memory alive in a country that was built by their sweat and their sacrifice. Hank Brennan set down his coffee cup. He did it slowly. He wrapped both of his scarred hands around the warm ceramic and held it for a long moment, the way a man holds something familiar when the room has just gone sharp again, and then he lifted his head and he looked at Jason Cole. He did not look at him with anger. He looked at him the way a man looks at his own grandchild, the way a man looks at a boy who has just learned that the world is bigger than his own small pride. And he reached out his right hand across the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He did not make a scene. He simply held out his scarred, shaking hand and he waited. And Jason Cole watched that hand. He saw the calluses on the knuckles. He saw the scar on the thumb from a piece of shrapnel in Korea. He saw the tremor that came from a wound the doctors could not name. He saw in that hand the entire history of a generation that had been drafted and had gone and had come back and had worked in gas stations and on assembly lines and in post offices and had never once asked the country for a thing in return. And Jason Cole reached out his own hand. He took Hank's hand. He gripped it. And Hank held it for a long moment and did not let go. The diner watched. The rain outside kept falling on the windows. The clock kept ticking. Somewhere a coffee pot began to drip into an empty cup. And the colonel stood behind them with his hand still raised in salute until Hank finally turned to him and nodded once, and the colonel lowered his hand and walked back to his booth and sat down, and the diner exhaled. CTA 11. Subscribe to this channel so the next story like this one finds you the moment it is released. Leave a single short phrase in the comments below. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. Every view of this story is one more small candle lit in a long line of candles lit in memory of the warriors who carried the weight of this country on their backs and still keep walking. And then something happened in that diner that no one expected. Hank Brennan picked up his coffee cup again. He took a slow sip. He looked at Jason Cole, and he began to speak. He did not speak in the loud voice of a man delivering a speech. He spoke in the quiet voice of a man telling a story he had never told anyone, in a diner where the eggs were getting cold and the coffee was getting refilled and the rain was still falling outside. He said that he had answered the draft in 1950 at the age of 18. He said that he had shipped out with his best friend Tommy Riley from the same little town they were sitting in right now. He said that Tommy had frozen to death on his back at Chausson, trying to keep Hank from bleeding out into the snow, and that Hank had survived only because Tommy would not move off him even when the order came to fall back. He said that he had answered the call again in 1965 at the age of 33, and that he had gone to Vietnam with a different unit, and that he had been a squad leader, and that he had walked into Hue City with 18 Marines in February of 1968, and that only 3 of them had walked out. He said that one of them had been himself. He said that one of them had been the colonel's older brother, who had been sitting in this same diner every Veterans Day for 14 years. He said that the third had been his own younger brother, Daniel, who had not walked out on his own but who had been carried out by Hank on his back across a bridge that was on fire. He said his brother's name had been Daniel Brennan. He said that Daniel had been 20 years old. He said that Daniel had wanted to be a teacher. He said that Hank had carried him home in a flag-draped box 2 months later. He said that he had not spoken of any of this in 47 years. He said that this diner was the only place in the entire town where he had ever felt safe enough to say the names of his brothers out loud. He said that the rain on the windows sounded like the river. He said that every Veterans Day, when the free breakfast came, he sat in this booth because if he sat anywhere else he would not be able to hear Tommy's laugh the way he had heard it in this diner one October afternoon in 1949, when they were both 17 and both scared of what was coming next. CTA 12. Stay with this story until the very end. Subscribe to this channel. Drop a single phrase in the comments below. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. Every phrase left on this channel is part of a wall that breathes for the warriors who can no longer breathe for themselves, and every view of this story is one more voice saying thank you to a generation that earned our freedom with their lives. And then the colonel stood up again from his back booth. He walked across the diner for the second time that morning. He did not salute. He did not speak. He simply walked up to Hank Brennan. He sat down across from him at booth 3. He laid his folded napkin on the table. He looked Jason Cole in the eye. He pointed at the chair next to him, and Jason sat down quietly. He put his hands on the table. He did not speak. The colonel reached into his inside jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it acro. Assessed the table to Hank. It was an old piece of paper, yellow with age. On it was a handwritten list of 42 names. It was the list of the Marines of Team Bravo, Charlie Company, 1st of the 5th, Hue City, February 1968. 42 names. 41 of them had a small handwritten cross beside the name. The 42nd name did not. The 42nd name was Walter Brennan. Hank looked at the list for a long time. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. The diner was silent in the way that diners are silent when something sacred is happening, when the walls themselves have become the witnesses. And Ruth, the waitress, set down a fresh cup of coffee in front of Hank without a word, because Ruth had known Hank for 19 years and Ruth had understood. On the morning he had first walked into her diner 19 years before, that he had been a man who had been waiting for someone to come and sit down across from him and look him in the eye and say the names of his brothers back to him. Ruth had been waiting for that too. Ruth had watched him eat alone every Tuesday for 19 years. Ruth had cried about it in the back kitchen on Veterans Day when nobody was looking, because Ruth knew what it meant for a man to sit alone in a diner with a folded list of his dead brothers tucked into the back pocket of his jeans and never once tell anyone what was inside. CTA 13. If this story has earned a place in your heart, subscribe to this channel right now and tap the bell so you never miss the next one. Drop a single short phrase in the comments. Semper Fi, never forget. Stay strong. Every comment left on this channel becomes part of the wall of brotherhood that still stands for the warriors who can no longer stand for themselves, and every view of this story tells a real veteran that his service was not given for nothing. And then Jason Cole did something that no one in the diner expected, including himself. He reached out across the table. He put his hand on top of Hank's hand. He did not speak. He did not apologize again. He simply held the old Marine's hand, and he bowed his head the way men bow their heads when they are finally understanding something that words cannot carry. And the colonel watched him do it. And the colonel did not stop him. Because the colonel had been a young lieutenant once, and had done the same thing in a field hospital in Vietnam when a sergeant twice his age had finally stopped yelling and had held his hand and had not let go. And the colonel had served 40 years after that night with the memory of that grip still holding him up. Outside, the rain had let up a little. The American flag above the gas station was hanging still now in the windless morning. The clock on the wall ticked over to 11. The diner stayed quiet for another full minute. And then Hank Brennan spoke again. He said one more sentence. He said it in a voice that cracked in the middle, the way old voices crack when they have held too much for too many years. He said that the diner was not a funeral. He said that the diner was not a memorial. He said that the diner was just the place where he came to drink coffee with his brothers even though his brothers were gone. He said that every Tuesday and every Thursday and every Veterans Day, when he sat down in booth 3, Tommy and Daniel and all 42 of them sat down with him. He said that the chair across from him was never empty. It was only waiting to be filled by whoever walked through the door next and was willing to be quiet enough to listen. He said that with a small smile. And then he released Jason's hand and picked up his coffee cup again. He took a sip, and the diner slowly began to breathe again. CTA 14, hit subscribe if you want to keep coming back to stories like this one. Drop a single phrase in the comments below. Semper Fi, never forget, stay strong. Choose the one that sits heaviest in your heart. Every phrase on this channel becomes one more voice in the quiet conversation that real veterans are still having in diners and on porches and in VFW halls all across this country. And every view of this story proves that the names of warriors like Tommy and Daniel and all 42 will never be forgotten. This is what real courage looks like. It does not look like a poster or a movie or a uniform pressed so perfectly that not one crease is out of place. It does not look like a speech given at a podium or a parade down Main Street with crowds lining the sidewalks. It looks like an old man in a faded gray cap sitting alone in a diner booth with his hands folded around a cold cup of coffee, and his dog tags resting against his chest, and his eyes watching the door. Because the door is where the next young man is going to walk in. And the next young man is the one who might finally sit down and listen. And listening is the only medicine that ever healed the wound of being a Marine who came home from a war that nobody wanted to talk ob. Out, real courage is quiet. It is the quiet of a man who has buried every friend he has ever made and who still comes back to this diner every Tuesday and every Thursday and every Veterans Day. It is the quiet of a man who carries a folded yellow list of 42 names in his back pocket and never shows it to anyone until somebody sits across from him with the kind of eyes that say stay. It is the quiet of a man who tips 20% on a fixed income because he wants the waitress to know that he still believes in kindness. It is the quiet of a man who lets every child in town walk across the crosswalk in front of him because he has already learned that every second of life is borrowed from someone who did not get to keep theirs, and he wants to give every second back to a child who still has a chance to grow up safe. Real courage looks like Hank Brennan. Real courage looks like the colonel who recognized him. Real courage looks like Jason Cole, who showed up drunk and loud and left quiet and broken in the right places, the broken places that grow back stronger if a man is willing to let them grow. And real courage looks like every veteran still walking the streets of this country today. It looks like every veteran eating breakfast alone in some diner somewhere because nobody ever walked in and sat down across from him and asked him to talk about where he has been. That is the courage we owe them. That is the courage we owe Hank Brennan. That is the courage we owe every quiet warrior still eating his coffee alone. CTA 15. Subscribe to this channel so the next story like this one finds you the moment it goes live. Drop a single phrase below. Semper Fi, never forget, stay strong. Whichever one your heart holds is the perfect one. Every comment on this channel is one small flag planted at the base of the flag of an unknown soldier, and every viewer of this story is one more voice reminding this country that the quietest heroes are still the most important ones we have ever had. And if you have a name that lives in your memory, a name of a father or a mother or a grandfather or a grandmother or an uncle or an aunt or a brother or a sister or a friend who ever wore the uniform of this country, leave that name in the comments below. Tell us their name. Say the words Semper Fi. Say the words never forget. Say stay strong. Say thank you for your service. Say whatever your heart holds for them. And when this story ends, take one moment of silence in your home. Take one breath for every old man still sitting alone in a diner booth somewhere this morning, waiting for someone to walk across the linoleum floor and sit down across from him and look him in the eye and listen. Take one breath for Tommy. Take one breath for Daniel. Take one breath for every name on every folded yellow list, in every old wallet, in every back pocket of every veteran still walking this country. And know that Hank Brennan is still sitting in that booth today. And that the chair across from him is still empty. And that the only thing he has ever asked for is for someone to walk through that door and sit down and remember his brothers out loud, so that not one of their names is ever lost. CTA 16. If the story of Hank Brennan stayed with you in a quiet place, leave a name in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel so the next chapter finds you. Say Semper Fi, say never forget. Say thank you for your service. And know that somewhere in this country, an old veteran is reading your comment tonight over a cup of cold coffee, and he is finally not quite so alone. That is the promise of channels like this one. That is the promise of every story like this one. And every name you leave behind is one more proof to a man like Hank Brennan that the flag above the gas station is still snapping in the wind because of him, and that the chair across from him will not be empty for much longer, and that the only thing he ever asked of this country in return was for someone to remember his brothers out loud, and that someone finally did. And in the end, the bravest thing any of us will ever do is sit down with a stranger, hold his hand, and say the names of his brothers back to him. And for an old Marine named Hank Brennan, that moment happened on a rainy Veterans Day morning in a small Tennessee diner called Millie's. And the one phrase that ended everything in that diner was the one that reminded the room that quiet heroes still breathe among us, still bleed among us, still stand among us, and still wait for the rest of us to remember them out loud.